Okay, there's another thing you should be able to pick out here. You're going to see, in some cases, the mucus cells are capped with serous cells, like we see here. And the serous cell is usually kind of an crescent or banana shape, sort of like a partial moon. So these are called what? The serous demilutes. Again, that's on your handout, serous demilutes. So it's a cavity of the mucus cells, these gray ones here, with these purple stained serous cells, serous demilutes. Okay? Any other questions on this? These are things you'll be able to pick out. So it shouldn't be a shock like put a pointer on this, or put a pointer on this type of cell and so on, ask what it is, or a blood vessel, or a salivary gland duct and ask you what it is. Okay? Okay. Now, as you know, there are two types of epithelium we're dealing with in the GI tract. We've already mentioned one, the non-keratinized stratified squamous. And where do we see that, besides on the tongue and the oral cavity? Where else do we see the non-keratinized stratified squamous in the GI tract? Obviously part of the throat. What part? The what? What's posterior to the oral cavity? What part of the throat? What do we call that? Oropharynx, okay. And just inferior to that, what part of the throat? Laryngopharynx. And then what's the tube that handles the food carries it from the throat or pharynx to the stomach? What do we call that? Esophagus, okay. Those are all lined, as is the oral cavity, with non-keratinized stratified squamous. How about the nasopharynx? Is that also non-keratinized stratified squamous? What is it? Have we dealt with that with the respiratory tract? It's a pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium like we see in the nasal cavity. Now why? Why isn't that non-keratinized stratified squamous too? What's the nasal cavity and the nasopharynx usually handle? Just air. Usually you don't have food going up your nose. All right? You're not eating through your nose. All right? You have a nasogastric tube running down. Okay, food isn't going to come in there. All right? So usually we're just handling air. You don't need the thick protective layer. There's another part of the GI tract where you also have that non-keratinized stratified squamous. What part is that? The other end. Handles fecal material. What is it? The anal canal. And you should be able to trace through the GI tract. I think it goes without saying. When I say trace through, and then just say mouth, throat, stomach, small and large intestine. I want you to tell me the parts of it as you're tracing through. As I mentioned to a couple of you don't need to worry about the sphincters unless I tell you otherwise. You don't need to worry about the curvatures. You should be able to trace through the tube from oral cavity, the oral cavity or mouth, okay, to the anus. That's the opening through which digestive waste pass. And that means you tell me the parts of the throat, the parts of the stomach, the parts of the small and large intestine as well. Okay? So we've already established that we've got non-keratinized stratified squamous at both ends, proximal and distal end of the GI tract. What lies in between? What kind of epithelium? What is it? Simple columnar epithelium. It's not pseudostratified, it's not ciliated, okay? It's simple columnar. So a single layer of column-shaped cells. Why do you want a thinner layer of tissue there?
To absorb.
To facilitate nutrient absorption. And where do we see that? Where do we first see that simple columnar? In the stomach. That continues through the small intestine and through most of the large intestine with the exception of the anal canal. Because in all these parts, you've got some absorption of nutrients. Just like when we talk about the respiratory tract. Where does gas exchange occur? Across the walls of what? The alveoli. And what's the wall of the alveoli? Each alveolus made of? Simple squamous, okay? How about the blood vessel that surrounds those alveoli? What's that made of? The wall. The tunica intima, simple squamous again, a little bit of loose connective tissue. That's it, there's not much tissue that the air has to cross. And same thing here. There's not a lot of tissue that the nutrients have to cross. So it facilitates the movement of things across that tissue. So if you think about it, it makes sense. Don't just try to memorize, make some sense of it. It'll be easier to remember if you do. If you just try to memorize, it's not going to make any sense to you. You're going to get confused on the exam. So like I say, in physiology, you can't just memorize and regurgitate. You got to know what you're studying and make some sense of it. Makes it a lot easier. Okay? All right, so here we have the junction between the esophagus and the stomach. And this is where we see the change in epithelium. On the right, what kind of tissue? Non-keratinized stratified squamous, like we saw lining the tongue in the oral cavity. Okay, multiple layers of flattened cells. Again, you can tell multiple layers of flattened nuclei. And to the left, you can see we're going into another type of epithelium, and that is simple columnar. This is what you see in the stomach. Okay. So here again, non-keratinized stratified squamous. We move to the left. You can see the epithelium changes. Keep it in focus. Look at the cells here. Look at the nuclei on the left there. Long, thin nuclei. And they contain long, thin cells. Columnar. Only one layer, so it's simple columnar epithelium. So stomach, esophagus. That's the junction. That's where the epithelium changes. Okay? Any questions? Okay, let's look at the stomach now. Now, the stomach lining is going to be the same epithelium that we saw in the esophagus. And that will also apply to the small intestine and much of the large intestine as well. Simple columnar epithelium. Now the stomach mucosa is thrown into folds. And you can see that very nicely on the models. When you look at the inside of the stomach, those models. What are those folds known as? Verrugae, okay? They're folds in the mucosa and submucosa. They're temporary folds. That is, they flatten out when food comes in the stomach and distends or stretches the walls. You can actually see them here, some of the verrugae. Okay, these large indentations are actually visible to the naked eye. But then there's some other features as well on the inside. You should be able to recognize those as well. So here again, you can see a couple of verrugae here and here. And we've got these tubular indentations. What are they called? Gastric pits. All right? And they're continuous with even deeper indentations. What are these? Those are the gastric glands. It cells the gastric glands that produce what is collectively referred to as gastric juice, most of which is secreted into the lumen of the stomach, which is where the food will be. All right? So again, these are the gastric pits, these indentations. Continues with that, these much deeper gastric glands. It's hard to tell, there's a cavity in there, so they're usually collapsed in these tissue sections. Okay? As I said, there are 4 cells you should be familiar with in the gastric glands. 3 of